and welcome to our Special Education Rule Changes. What does this mean for families? Workshop today with Marilyn Mahusky, staff attorney with Vermont Legal Aid's Disability Law Project, and myself, Karen Price, co-director of Family Support, Vermont Family Network. All of our workshops, including previous ones, are recorded and can be watched on our VFN YouTube channel. The link is on our website, which is vermontfamilynetwork.org. Everyone who registered for today's workshop will receive a follow-up email with the link to this recording and a PDF of the presentation with live links. Vermont Family Network has been serving families of children with special health needs and disabilities and professionals who serve them for more than 30 years. We are the federally designated Parent Training and Information Center, the Family to Family Health Information Center, and the Vermont chapter of both Family Voices and Parent to Parent USA. Today's workshop is being recorded, so please keep that in mind as you share information about your situation. This session will include live captions. If you want to turn them off, click on Live Transcript, then Hide Subtitle. If you're comfortable, you're welcome to turn on your camera. You can ask questions using the chat box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to share information or links to resources that you found helpful in chat as well. We know that you can all learn a lot from each other. So I'm excited to introduce you to Marilyn Mahusky. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good afternoon, and thank you. So let's go into the next slide. This is just my welcome slide. As Karen said, I am a staff attorney with Vermont Legal Aid's Disability Law Project and was involved in the Act 173 Census-Based Funding Advisory Group, as was Karen on behalf of Vermont Family Network. So we were both very much involved in the process of changing these rules. So what is Act 173? Act 173 was passed by our legislature in 2018. And the purpose of that, and I'll read it here just because I think it's really important, which is to enhance the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services provided to students who require additional support in Vermont school districts. Next slide, please. So there, and go on to the next. So there are three primary effects of the rule. The first is that the changes the funding mechanism for special education from a reimbursement model to a census-based block grant model by 2025. It changes the rules for independent schools, and it also addresses the needs of struggling students. So what does that mean? The reimbursement model, we're going from a model where a bill is submitted for the services and then the services are reimbursed to the school district. It's more complicated than that, but change to a census-based block grant model means that school districts will get a block grant amount of money, and out of that pot of funds, they will need to ensure that students on an IEP get those services that they're entitled to. Students on a 504 get those services that they're entitled to, but also to provide students, the broader range of students who struggle, which includes students who really may struggle for any reason, to ensure that they get the services that they need as well. Go on to the next slide. So how did this come about? I'll go ahead and have you put up the next as well. Rachel, thank you. Yeah, just go ahead and put it up. So how did this change come about? The first was that the legislature invited two studies. One is the study by the University of Vermont, and they were asked to look at the current funding model and then to also look at the census-based funding model and as well as some other models and come up with a recommendation. And part of the reason that was done is that there was this feeling that administratively that the cost for the reimbursement model was just simply too much, that the model was misaligned with policy priorities. And this really has to do with the system that is a policy of the state of Vermont, which is that we deliver our services in a multi-tiered system of supports. And a part of that multi-tiered system of supports is positive behavioral interventions and supports for students. The reimbursement model creates misplaced incentives. This was a finding of the UVM for student identification. It discourages cost containment. And finally, with the next slide, it's unpredictable and lacks transparency. So this, thank you. You can move on to the next slide as well. So the next report that the legislature requested was the GMG report. And I'm gonna forget, no, go back up, please. Yeah. I'm going to forget what that acronym stands for. I should have written it out. It's been a while since I've looked at it. But the DMG report looked at best practices for the delivery of special education services. And I believe the AOE had invited them in to look very carefully at a number of school districts and then make these recommendations. So their recommendations really were 5, is that it's important that core instruction meets the needs of most students. What is core instruction? That's the tier 1, that's the math, the English, the language arts, that reaches, that core instruction meets the needs of most students. That when you're providing instructional time outside of core subjects to students who struggle, oh, actually, I said that wrong. So that what happens often for a lot of our students who struggle is that they're pulled out to get their interventions. If they've identified that they have a weakness in language arts, we pull them out during language arts to provide them with intensive services. But the recommendation is no, they need both. They need to be in with their general ed peers, getting core instruction, and that we provide their interventions in addition to the core instruction. We want to ensure that students who struggle receive their education from highly skilled teachers. The 4th goal is to create or strengthen a systems-wide approach to supporting positive student behaviors based on expert support. And this was noted by the legislature. They felt that this was something that was important and also reinforced by the findings of the DMG group. And finally, that to provide specialized instruction from skilled and trained experts to students with more intensive needs. What we find is that very often children with the most intensive needs are spending most of their time with our educators who are the least expert and the least skilled. So very often children with intensive needs may be getting most of their instruction from, for example, a paraeducator, as opposed to a special educator or an educator who has a skill in a particular subject matter area.
Oh, and Marilyn, it is the district management group.
Thank you, district management group. Yes, that should have just rolled off my tongue. You can move on to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that in addition to changing sort of the funding structure, the committee looked at, or the legislature directed, established a summer study committee in 2017 and charged them with making recommendations on the criteria to be used for the State Board of Education for designating approved independent schools. As you know, in Vermont, we sort of have a unique structure. We have public schools, and we also have a large number of independent schools that in some instances really serve as sort of the quasi-public school in a community. So they're an essential part of our educational delivery system. So they were tasked, this summer study committee was tasked with giving the state board information on how to designate an approved independent school. Part of this was relative to ensuring that the independent schools were also able to deliver services to all students. And so the recommendations were focused on making recommendations for enrollment, limitations on enrollment, and also to be looking at how independent schools are required to deliver special education and in what categories of and for what categories of disability. So for people who have children with disabilities, you know that there are 13 disability categories under the IDEA. And in order for a child to qualify, one of the first steps is that the child needs to fall within the definition of one of those disability categories. The bigger independent schools, most of them are actually approved already to deliver services for the entire range of children's disability categories, but some of the smaller schools were not. So this is really ensuring that, that children have choice. So moving on to the next slide. So we were not involved in the independent study. However, it sounds like it was a challenging group. But one of the things that the group did agree on was that this premise that Vermont students with disabilities should be free to attend the schools that they, their parents, and their local education deem appropriate to them. And I should note that independent schools already are covered under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which prohibits discrimination in education. So for any public entity, for example, a school that receives public funds, federal funds, then they would be covered under 504, and it would be impermissible for them to discriminate against students with disabilities. One of the things that we had seen, and as we testified on this issue, is that sometimes we had come across instances where some of the independent schools were not permitting children with disabilities, or were inviting students with disabilities to maybe move on. So this was a really important policy goal and a policy statement of principle that students with disabilities have the same right to choose an educational institution as their non-disabled peers. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the framework under which all of this took place. And what this led us to, once Act 173 was passed, was a directive by the legislature that the Agency of Education initiate rulemaking. So rulemaking is very prescribed, I guess is one way to say that. So by statute, the AOE drafts a proposed rule. They submit it to the State Board of Education. The State Board holds public hearings. They adopt a rule, and then that rule is sent to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules for final approval. LCAR is part of the General Assembly. So that's the process that gets employed whenever there is an agency directive to draft a rule. So that's what happened here, is that the agency proposed a rule. That rule was drafted in part and with consideration by the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group, which was part of the legislation, which was the entity charged with giving the agency guidance on the development of the rules. Next slide. So some of the major changes to the rules, because we're here to talk about how do these rules affect students with disabilities, and in particular students who might qualify for special education. So aside from the funding, which was a big piece of this, and there is a new rule that has been passed by the State Board of Education, adopted, I should say, by the State Board of Education on changes to the funding. So that is going to become effective. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. 2025, I think, is when the funding shift actually occurs, but these rules will come into effect in July 1 of 2022. Right, because we're about ready to go into a new year. So the major changes to the rule as it affects special education is the definition of special education services, and that's a term actually out of the federal rules. The definition of adverse effect. We were successful in advocating for the addition of functional performance to the basic skill areas, elimination of the discrepancy model, and an increased voice for parents. So we're going to talk about each of these a little bit more. Next slide, please. Yeah, you can go ahead and put all of that slide up. Thank you. So the old rule, special education rules are in a series of rules that the State Board has passed, which we refer to as the 2360 series. So the old rule 2362.2.12, the definition of special education means specially designed instruction that cannot be provided within the school's standard instructional conditions or provided through the school's educational support system. So that's not the entire rule, but that's the critical piece. On the other side of the slide, you have at no cost to parents that special education meets the unique needs of the child with a disability. That meets the unique needs of the child that result from the child's disability, and ensures that the child with a disability has access to the general curriculum so that child can meet educational standards applied to all children. So what the new rule focuses on is really that language of you can qualify for special education if the instruction cannot be provided within the school standard instructional support system. That was inconsistent with the federal law. So one of the most important changes I feel we made was advocating for the adoption of the federal rule. And this will have, I think, significant consequences for students with disabilities. Next slide, please. So under the new rule, as I said, you see that we have the same no cost to parents, which is part of what's required under the IDEA. You know, you're entitled to a free, appropriate public education, free meaning no cost to the parents, that it's appropriate, and that it's publicly funded. So by changing the definition, special education services, we broadened it from special education to special education services. It means specially designed instruction. And that is the mirror of the federal law, that special education means that you're receiving, if you qualify, that you're receiving specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of the child with the disability. Move on to the next slide, please. So as I said, the major changes in the rule is the change in that terminology. And we were successful in advocating for that change in the funding rule to be carried over into the funding rule and also into the 2360 series. So we're no longer looking at, well, what does the school have in terms of its EST, its educational support team, but looking at, does the child need specialized instruction? And we're going to talk in a minute about how we make that analysis, but we're focusing on what are the child's needs and not on what's available within that particular school system. So it eliminates the not otherwise available within the standard instructional support system. Sorry, so I'm reading that again. So we can't deny based on what's otherwise available or not available. And this is important. And what we're not talking about here is the multi-tiered system of supports. But special education is different from multi-tiered system of supports. But when I mentioned the DMG group, what they were talking about was giving core instruction, right? That's where most kids get their needs met, is through that intensive core instruction, which should be happening particularly in the early grades. So if kids are getting that core instruction, some students may have enhancements to that because of their special education needs, but you still are able to get both, or one doesn't necessarily preclude you from the other. But what the change does is it means you don't have to wait to fail in order to qualify for an evaluation for special education. Okay, next slide, please. So the rule 2362, the current rule, this is what the current rule is. It's not a whole lot different from the old rule, but there are some significant effects. One, so to qualify for special education, we know in Vermont we have 3 gates, right? So we have you're a child with a disability within one of the 13 disability categories that I mentioned. Your child has a specific learning disability, autism spectrum disorder, whatever the category is, deaf, hard of hearing, there are criteria under which that's determined. That disability results in an adverse effect on the child's educational performance in one or more basic skill areas, and that the child needs special education to access and benefit from their educational program. We had advocated unsuccessfully for the removal of that second gate, adverse effect. Part of the reason I think that we weren't successful for that is that actually within some of the disability categories, adverse effect is actually part of the definition. But there are a couple of areas which I'll show on the next slide where adverse effect is not included. One of the reasons we had advocated for that is that for the removal is that in our experience, and I think VFN would agree with this, is that there are many children who need support and individualized instruction who did not get it, in part because they were maintaining their grades. They were doing relatively well. And so we spent a lot of time, instead of focusing on does the child have a disability? What do they need do they need specialized instruction? And what is that specialized instruction? How could it be provided? We were focusing, teams were focusing on adverse effect and trying to determine whether or not there was an adverse effect on their educational performance in one or more basic skill areas. So hopefully by changing the emphasis on that, it will make a difference in terms of children and how they qualify. And the Agency of Education added the term to access. So that's one of the differences between the old rule and the new rule. So next slide, please. So as I said, adverse effect is no longer required for two of the categories under the disability categories. One is deaf blindness and the other one is specific learning disability. Like I said, it's not gone. So here's an example of one disability category, the autism spectrum disorder category, which still requires an opinion of a licensed psychologist or medical physician, training and experience and understanding in autism disorders, and its effect on a student's ability to function and whether there is adverse effect on the child's educational performance. What this does, though, is it changes again the emphasis from we're not even going to get to really that determination of whether the child's disability has an adverse effect on their educational performance, because we got caught up on the gate number 2 in looking at a very narrow emphasis on adverse effect. An important change to this as well is that it mirrors the federal rules, and that was a theme that we argued throughout, is that the changes to the special education rules ought to mirror the federal rules, because there were a number of really important instances where Vermont rules did not mirror the federal rules. So you can move on to the next slide. So although we didn't remove gate 2, we did get a change in the definition of adverse effect. And that's why this is highlighted. So the old rule was to determine whether a child's disability has an adverse effect on educational performance. The evaluation planning team first had to determine whether the student is functioning significantly below grade norms compared to peers in one or more of the basic skill areas. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but the basic skill areas tended to focus primarily on academic skills. And yet the special education law is really broader than that. We don't look only at academic skills, but we really look at the child's overall functioning. And I'll talk a little bit more about the impact of adding functional skills to the basic skill areas when we look at adverse effect. So the new rule, we use the terms adverse effect and adversely affected interchangeably, and it means to have a negative impact on the basic skill areas. We're getting rid of that substantial, significant, or marked, or in other words, it doesn't need that negative impact doesn't need to be substantial, significant, or marked, but it does need to be more than minor or transient. A big part of this rule actually was taken from the main rules, their special education definition. So that was really helpful to take a look at those. So next slide, please. I think, are we one slide ahead? Yeah, I think, is there one slide that you can go back under the, there we go. So to determine adverse effect under the new adverse effect rule, again, we're not just looking at academic areas, but we're looking at adverse effect on disability in the basic skill areas. Like I said, it includes the academic, but also the functional, that's evidenced by findings and observations. It's based on data sources and objective assessments with replicable results. So this is really critical, is that it gives more, sort of more space to be looking at in terms of a child's performance when we're making that determination. That the planning team must use a range of diagnostic and performance data and must consider academic as well as non-academic aspects of child's functioning. This is going to really have an important impact on students who maybe are on the autism spectrum, but who are maybe higher functioning. And so they're doing well academically, but have some other specific deficits that previously were not able to be addressed under special education. It could also, I think we'll see a big impact on children with emotional disabilities. as well, because again, some kids with mental health issues may have be performing well academically, but struggling in other areas. So we're going to be looking at this differently. Next slide, please. It's important that those deficiencies persist or will persist over time in spite of specific alternative strategies being provided within the general ed setting. So, you know, we're not looking at just one instance of a challenge, but really looking at how that plays out over a period of time. The planning team should document that scientific research-based interventions were implemented with fidelity. Some of this is a connection with MTSS, is that we want to make sure that we are actually documenting the interventions that we're using with children, that they're actually research-based interventions, that they're being implemented with fidelity, because that will all have an impact as you're looking at that data over a period of time to determine what is the impact, the adverse impact on that child's educational performance. The planning team will consider these efforts and their impact when determining adverse educational performance. So that's the new adverse effect rule. It's going to, I think some schools are going to have, this is going to be an area where there's going to need to be some focus on, I think, professional development for educators in terms of making these, shifting their thinking in how we determine what is and is not adverse effect. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, one aspect of that is the addition of functional skills. So these are the basic skill areas that the definition or the eligibility determination criteria refers to. And as you can see, those are mostly academic. There is motor skills in there, but reading, written expression, oral expression, math skills, math calculations. So by adding functional skills, and move on to the next slide and we'll see what that definition means. I'm sorry, next slide, please. So the definition of functional skills, and that's actually, this was already in the rules, so this was not a real heavy lift to actually add this to the basic skill areas, but it means the acquisition of essential and critical skills needed for a child with disabilities to learn specific daily living, personal, social, and employment skills, or the skills needed to increase performance and independence at work, in school, in the home, in the community, for leisure, for post-secondary, and other lifelong opportunities. That's a really broad definition. And yet this is really what encompasses part of special education. This is a change that was reflected in the federal law that Vermont had not really adopted or taken to heart in terms of the provision of special education services. So as I said, we think this is going to have a real huge impact on students with autism spectrum disorders, especially those with higher functioning, and then students with emotional disabilities. Next slide, please. So moving on to number, I can't know, is this number 3 or 4 in terms of what are the major changes under Act 173 is the definition of specific learning disabilities. So as I said earlier, look at the bottom there, there's no adverse effect requirement. So this is where a lot of students really got tripped up in terms of being able to access special education services in the past, is that the federal definition of specific learning disabilities does not have an adverse effect requirement. However, we were requiring adverse effect prior to it as part of the decision to determine whether or not they were eligible for special education. So I think we're going to see a huge impact for children who are really struggling with some of those reading, writing, math, calculation skills. So this is going to be a really important change. So under the new rule, districts are no longer allowed to use the discrepancy model. What that means is that the definition of that is it's a 1.5 standard deviations or more between the ability and expected level of performance in basic skills. Again, that was a reference to basic skills when we're only looking at academic skills, right? So that 1.5 standard deviation is no longer allowed to be used by school districts, or will not be allowed to be used by school districts in July. The district must determine whether the student responds to scientific, research-based interventions or use a model-based and other research-based procedures. Again, this is a change that was made in the federal law quite a while ago, but really looks at, are you trying interventions that are actually research-based in making a determination of whether or not a child has a specific learning disability? Next slide, please. Oh, that gets me almost to the end. So the effective date of all of these changes is July 1, 2022, which is hard to believe that that means the beginning of the next school year. So that's just a kind of a really quick, I hope, down and dirty view of what those changes are. I think it remains to be seen how they're going to play out, but we're really hopeful. I think that this is going to have a very positive impact on students with disabilities. There is another really important component to this, which is changes to the parent's voice in this process. And I'm going to turn the monitor over to Karen with Vermont Family Network, who can speak to the changes in Act 173 relative to parent participation. So Karen.
Thanks, Marilyn.
Sure. Oh, I guess before I let you go there, just you'll get a copy of these, but if anyone needs assistance, you're welcome, or has specific instances involving their child or questions, you can feel free to contact legal aid through that. So now you can take it away, Karen. Sorry about that.
Okay, thanks. So go ahead, yeah. So I just would like to start off by pointing out that one of the 6 principles of IDEA is parent and student participation in decision-making. So IDEA requires that parents and school personnel work together to provide children with appropriate educational services and ensures that the rights of children with disabilities and parents of such children are protected. So parents are defined as a biological or adoptive parent, a foster parent, a guardian authorized to act as the child's parent or authorized to make educational decisions for the child, an individual acting in the place of biological or adoptive parent, and that could include a grandparent, step-parent, or other relative with whom the child lives, or an individual who is legally responsible for the child's welfare, or an education surrogate parent. Okay, next slide. So in the commentary to the federal regulations, it states that parents are free to provide input into their child's IEP through a written report if they so choose. So for parents who are new to the IEP process or new to Vermont, they are often surprised that there's no place to sign the IEP. They have asked, how do I show my approval or disapproval? BFN family support consultants may have advised them to send their input in writing to the team or to make sure it's documented in the meeting minutes, but those are not part of the IEP documents. So with this rule change, parent input will be sought out and documented as part of the IEP process. So I'll go ahead and read this rule. The IEP shall contain a section for parents to provide written comments regarding their child's IEP, following an IEP meeting to write or amend an IEP. The LEA shall send the IEP to the parent together with prior written notice of decision. The parent shall be provided up to 10 days to complete and return the parent input section of the IEP. The purpose of the parent input section is to facilitate feedback from families to ensure they have an opportunity to express any opinions about the IEP or the IEP process. Upon receipt of parent input, the LEA may, but is not required to, schedule a meeting to discuss parental concerns. So for more information and pre-recorded webinars, visit the Vermont Agency of Education Special Education Rule Changes page. So again, you will get a PDF with a live link, but the information that I'm presenting is on the AOE page as well. So this is not meant to suggest that the parent should not have input prior to and during the IEP process. Parents should be encouraged to share their thoughts, concerns, questions, and suggestions on all sections of the IEP. So next slide. So the Vermont Agency of Education has provided this example feedback template for school teams. So again, that is available on the website page that we had put the link on the last slide. Keep in mind that parent input should already be strongly represented in the present levels of performance, as that portion of the IEP forms the basis for the child's IEP goals, services, and supports. Just leave this on for a second. You want to read it? Okay, next slide. So parents can ask that the related service of parent training and counseling be put in your child's IEP. The parent input information can help educators support you by providing needed parent training and counseling in order for you to help your child with their IEP goals at school and in the community. Next slide. So the parent input form is a step forward in ensuring that parents are equal members of the IEP team. Parents should also know their procedural safeguards, including dispute resolution options, understand how the different parts of the IEP tie together, and also to make sure that you ask for accommodations if you need them in order to participate in an IEP meeting. Okay, so that is the end of the formal presentation. And at this point, that's our contact information. And as Marilyn was pointing out, if you have any questions about any part of your child's program, call DLP, call us. This is our contact information. And we do have a few questions. Feel free at this point to be putting any questions that you might have in chat. A few questions had been sent to us prior to the presentation, and I can go ahead and read them. And we'll try to answer them, but please feel free to put any other questions you might have in chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and maybe raise your hand and go ahead and ask your question. So let me just go through the questions that we received. A few of the questions that we received are not related to the changes in the rules. So if you do not hear your question being read and answered, please feel free to call us at VFN or to call DLP for the answers to those questions. So let me go ahead and read the first one here. Do these changes, the rule changes, primarily affect younger students, or are there implications for older or transitioning young adults? So Marilyn, I think we had discussed that there isn't a specific section that talks about that would benefit older or transition age youth. Mm-hmm. The functional skills piece is strengthened. Mm-hmm. Help the transition plan in an IEP. And that would help the team look at, even though the transition age in Vermont is 16, and as advocates, we had hoped that we could move that transition age to 14, but it still remains at 16. However, transition planning can begin before the age of 16. Mm-hmm. And with strengthening the functional skills, that can be a piece that will cause the team to look at transition perhaps a little earlier than 16. So what do you think, Marilyn?
I think too, it will also enable the team to be looking more deeply at transition skills in terms of what are the students' goals for life after high school? Is it college? Is it work? For some students, it might be leisure activities. It's a very broad definition of what functional skills are. So it should, I think that would be where I would be looking if I'm a parent and I'm advocating on behalf of my student, is looking at those functional skills and trying to tailor the goals and objectives of my transition plan around some of those broader transition skills, the functional skills. So it doesn't just affect young kids, it really does have an impact on all students who may qualify for special education.
Okay, another question we have is, if my child is evaluated this year, will adverse effects still be considered as it is going away next year?
Yeah, well, as I said, the law does not become effective until July 1 of 2022. However, I think the strong argument could be made, and I think as a parent, as someone who represents parents and students with disabilities, my recommendation would be to try and work with the team to say, okay, we know that this is going away, so why don't we begin that process? And I think some school districts will go ahead and begin to be more forward-looking in terms of how they evaluate students, but there will be some school districts that are probably going to drag their heels. It may be that you could ask for, go ahead and let the school district do their evaluation, which they get the first opportunity to do so. If you're not happy with that evaluation, you can ask for an independent evaluation. That can sometimes take a while. It may be that you're going to have a challenging year, but come July 1, I'd say I'd like my child to be reevaluated using the new criteria.
Okay, Marilyn, I don't know whether we have the answer to this one, but has the AOE provided any guidance on identifying children with SLD, specific learning disabilities?
I can't answer that question.
Yeah,
I really don't know. Yeah. Karen, I did see somebody with their hand up.
Yeah, Marilyn, so you did send a message.
I did. I was writing when that question was just asked. So I have a follow-up question for the
Well,
question.
why don't you go ahead and read, all of it since.
So my follow-up question to that is, if we just had a conversation that this is now aligning more with federal guidelines, and as parents, when we work with advocates or go to workshops and attend any of the rights law, they always let us know that the federal law really does trump state law. So if a parent wanted to recourse it now because it is more aligned with the federal guidelines and we are technically out of compliance with that, what route would they have to take?
Well, of course, in terms of, we always have remedies, right? So I'm going to back up for just a second and we'll talk about that, right? You always have the right to request mediation if you have a disagreement with the school district. You certainly have the right to file for due process. You also would have the right to file an administrative complaint. But I think what you're asking, and this is going to the issue of adverse effect, right? Okay, so remember that adverse effect still needs to be taken into consideration for 11 of the disability categories. So the school district still has to, or the team still has to address that issue of adverse effect. So absolutely, I mean, I don't have my federal rules right in front of me, so I'd have to kind of think for a minute about, I mean, the federal rules absolutely are supreme, right? That's the supremacy clause. We have the federal rules trump the state's laws and the state's rules where there's a conflict. Do you want to escalate things to that point, or do you want to try and resolve the problem? The problem being, can I have my child evaluated for special education? Can that eligibility determination be made during this sort of gray period? As someone who represents parents, I'd say absolutely advocate for it. Yes, you could say, well, if you look at the federal rules, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Again, I think and this is not, I know this is looking at your face, this is not the answer you're looking for. I mean, sure, you can file litigation and say, you're not following federal law. I don't think, that's going to take forever. So I'm trying to be practical in this approach of like, what are ways that you could try to push the particular school district to do the right thing? Maybe contact the agency of education. Maybe that particular school district needs support. We do know that as part of the change that the agency was responsible for providing professional development, there may be school districts that need that professional development so they can understand what these changes are and how to implement them, that they may not have that skill. So that would be one area, is to bring in experts. The other is, I mean, I have been successful in the past of getting school districts just to go straight to the independent evaluator, so that have the independent evaluator look at it from that different perspective. So you're absolutely right. Rights law is going to say, and certainly others would say, the federal law definitely trumps. But in terms of how are you going to practically address that, we're just thinking of what are strategies that you could do to sort of push that. And I think too, as you know, you could call VFN and talk to an advocate. You can call the Disability Law Project and talk to an advocate and understand your child's specific situation. And we could maybe come up with more tailored recommendations for how you could do that. You know, the other thing is that sometimes when an advocate gets involved, sometimes people change their recalcitrance and they decide that maybe they're gonna go ahead and do the right thing. So I do, you know, I think it remains to be seen. And I do think that there are some school districts who are going to do this really well. The transition is going to be done as seamlessly as possible. And there are others that it's going to, you know, unfortunately, I think there are some students who are just really going to get stuck in that middle place, unfortunately. But there is hope, because come July, come June, you could say, okay, I'm going to ask for a reevaluation over the summer so that when the school year starts, my child, you know, we're ready to go. That's a little small comfort when you think about the year lost or the possible year lost.
Marilyn, did you have another question, or was that?
Oh, so is the parent concerns an error that you would appropriately put if you're doing a partial reject of the IEP or want to do a stay put? What's the best course to go about that on the IEP?
Marilyn, I think the stay put is still going to be a separate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of has its own definition. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think as Karen said when she was discussing that is, you know, this was a really important advocacy piece in terms of getting parent input and that feedback. And I think that you could just say, I disagree with this determination or this aspect of my child's IEP, and I would like the team to continue to meet. But yes, go ahead and provide my child with the other services in the IEP, right? Depending on what that is. And if you need to push the other piece, then you can start pushing that piece of that where there's that point of disagreement. Stay put is a little bit different. Now you're talking about placement, right? And so if you file for due process and the issue is over your child's placement, that's when you ask for stay put, right? If you're talking about moving your child to a different placement, or the school wants to move the child and you want your child to stay while there's that disagreement, or in the suspension and expulsion area. So yes, you can always invoke stay put as placement, but stay put is not the same thing as I disagree with this aspect of my child's IEP. I disagree with the determination that there's no adverse effect. And then if there is, you know, then I suppose if the determination is there's no adverse effect because you didn't get through gate number 2 in the old analysis, then you could appeal that decision, right? You could file for due process then and challenge that. You probably would want to have an independent evaluator being able to support your position that the wrong tools were used or the wrong analysis was made in that determination. Did see another.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple of questions here, and I know I did see a hand raised as well for me to tell other sequence. Yeah, there are actually quite a few questions. Will kids need to be reevaluated with this new rule in advance of their reevaluation date? Is one, how are schools being supported to implement the highly skilled teacher concept? It seems like a complete redesign of some schools. So I don't think we can answer the school piece. You know, will kids need to be reevaluated with this new rule in advance of their reevaluation date?
So I think if your child already qualifies for special education, I don't think you need to be very concerned. I think that you need to follow the timeframes in terms of ensuring that your child's IEP is updated annually. If you're going into a 3-year evaluation, then yes, you would have wanted to be advocating for the use of the new criteria. But the timeframes are really that there's no difference there. But again, if your child already is on an IEP, then you have probably less concern for how these new rules are going to play out than for parents of students who have been denied special education in the past, or for children kind of coming up and not yet identified.
There's a question here. I can certainly send this one to the Agency of Education. Is there a master list of research-based models that schools will use to determine a response? That I'm pretty sure Marilyn and I cannot answer.
Right, yeah.
Let me see. As a school counselor, I am encouraged to hear the mention of parent training and counseling. Will these services need to be provided within the education team or could be supporting with our mental health agencies? So I think the short answer to that is the team will determine the nature of the parent training and counseling and then have to make that additional step of determining the best way to deliver the services. So the best provider who can provide the service and how the parent training and counseling service will be provided.
Right.
So it depends on what is actually needed at that point, and then to figure out who should be best suited to provide service. And then I see the question, what if your district is not using research-based methods? How are SLD students going to be identified? Again, I think that piece we cannot answer here. That's a more specialized piece. Again,
I would just jump in and say if they're not using that, then I would be asking that they switch and start using that, right? And if the school doesn't have those resources, then I think that would be, I do think there's value in parents reaching out to the agency and letting the agency know, because part of the conversation that's been going on for the last couple of years, even longer relative to these changes, is that there are some school districts that are ready, willing, and able to make this transition. And then there are others that are going to really struggle. And so it's important for the agency to identify those school districts who are going to struggle and then be able to put the resources to that, to give resources to that district so that they are able to make that transition. So I think that's a really important piece, because part of there was money put into Act 173 to help with that piece of professional development. Karen, I just want to say, I see Matthew has his hand up.
Yes. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yes. Thank you very much for taking my question. My question is, should there be oversight of this new rollout, of this program? So school districts, around Vermont, has someone there to know that they have certain needs for that specific child, because every district is different within Vermont. And when a new program or a new rule being, out there, some of these districts may not have either the necessary or means, resources to have, like you said, to come up with those, specialized, help needs. So my main question is, could there or would there be oversight over this? So we actually get basically children and students that have disabilities will get the help they actually need.
So I think, one thing is that there is monitoring, right? So the agency is required to monitor school districts. So in terms of oversight, that's a really good question, is like, how are we going to measure that schools are doing this, right? How are we going to know which schools are doing it well, which schools are doing it poorly, and which schools are somewhere in the middle? I think that's a question for the agency, and it's worth maybe us bringing back as part of our group of like what is the agency thinking about in terms of ensuring that this transition happens smoothly. I mean, I do think that they're doing some listening. I think they're trying to do some trainings. So I think it's not like the agency is just sitting back, I don't think, and doing nothing, but I do think this is a pretty big undertaking, and it remains to be seen how well it's going to roll out, and how well it rolls out in various districts. So that's a good point. I guess I don't really have an answer for that, Matthew.
But yes, the link that is in one of my slides, that is a link to the special education rule changes. That is a page on the Agency of Education website, and there is a whole list that there are recordings on this, and the AOE is having monthly sessions scheduled. So yes, basically they are in the process of doing trainings. So it is a process that they have started and, playing through the year. So I guess yes, the short answer is the Agency of Education is providing resources and training to the school districts. They have started, they will continue to do them. So I know it is 1:55. I'm looking to see if there are any questions. Let me see. Who is responsible for diagnosing a specific learning disability, assuming this is reference to a specific dyslexia assessment? Is the district responsible for assessing this, or is it a parent who needs to seek an outside assessment?
So, the answer to that is that the school has an obligation to do that first. So as a parent, if you suspect, or if there's a teacher who suspects, someone else suspects that your child has a disability or is struggling, then it is incumbent on the school district to evaluate that. So one of the things we really didn't talk about was sort of that interplay or much between a multi-tiered system of supports and special education. But if you suspect your child has a disability, then you as a parent have the right to request that your child be evaluated. You do not need to wait to undergo an MTSS system. But if you have a reason to believe your child may have a specific learning disability, then you ask for an evaluation, and the school district has an obligation to undertake that. And if you disagree with that assessment, then you do have the right to ask for an independent evaluation. There are some limited criteria on that. Usually, sometimes it has to do, the criteria maybe who you could choose to use for an independent evaluator. But if the school disagrees, then they would have to initiate filing for due process. But yes, school districts always get the first crack at evaluating to determine whether or not your child qualifies for a disability. And they do have an affirmative obligation under federal and state law to identify and evaluate children and provide services to children with disabilities. So I think we are going to see a little bit of tension between schools that, are moving into or strengthening their multi-tiered systems of support and not knowing exactly when, where, how to assess a child's progress there or lack thereof, and then to ensure that more intensive services are provided. But if you suspect your child has a specific learning disability, then you certainly are entitled to request an evaluation, a special education evaluation.
Yep. And I'll just answer one really quick one, since we are just about out of time. What is the most appropriate AOE contact for parents? The AOE Special Education Division does have a technical assistance line. So there is a specific number for that. I can dig it up for you, for any of you, if you send us a message. I don't have it available on my screen right now, but they do have a TA line for parents and professionals to call. So I think it is time to wrap up. I think we were able to get to a lot of the questions, but again, feel free to contact us directly at Disability Law Project or Vermont Family Network with your questions. You will see a link to the evaluation in chat, so you'll also receive it in the follow-up email. Please take a few minutes to complete it so that we can make improvements and fulfill our grant requirements. So we have many more interesting workshops coming up. You can find details about those on the homepage of our website, vermontfamilynetwork.org, along with the links to previously recorded ones. We have tons of information on our website, and getting connected with us is easy. You can follow us on Facebook or join our closed Facebook page if you are a parent. So we are here to help. Please contact us by phone or by email. So thank you everyone for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you.